But was that the case with Rafah? For instance, not just in Rafah, but
We've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas.
well, okay. Well, what about the ceasefire?
We wanted to see a ceasefire, but we have always been
we have
always been committed to the destruction of Hamas. We did want to see a ceasefire, but we have always made clear that we wanted to see a different authority moving forward in governance of Gaza.
Okay, but so for instance, other UN satellite image shows that 66% of Gaza structures have been damaged. And you earlier today said that the U.S. supports the targeting of terrorist infrastructure, not civilian infrastructure. Does the U.S. believe 66% of Gaza's buildings are terrorist infrastructure?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Which is why we have been engaged to try to reach a ceasefire to end that conflict, which is why we have been pushing for a ceasefire to months. And I wish that Hamas would come to the table and work with us on a ceasefire. As you heard me saying earlier, Hamas has been absent for weeks, won't even respond to the mediators putting forward ideas asking whether they would agree to a ceasefire or not. Look, you can talk about Israel and the culpability that Israel has and the tough decisions that Israel needs to make. And it's absolutely true that Israel needs to make tough decisions to get to a ceasefire. But the way out of this conflict is a ceasefire. And it is Hamas that is missing in action right now that won't come to the table to talk about one.
And then finally, a few weeks ago, the U.S. ambassador to the UN said, quote, "I do not believe that Palestinians as they exist right now have all the elements to give it statehood." What do you think, which elements are Palestinians missing? And do you think the U.S. continual unconditional support to bomb Gaza and Palestine supports achieving those elements?
Well, I'll give you one of the elements that is missing, which is Palestinian Authority governance of Gaza. You've seen Hamas in charge of Gaza going back months or going back years. We have tried to reach, or we have put forward ideas for Palestinian Authority governance of Gaza and ultimately a unified Gaza and the West Bank. That's something that would be a prerequisite to a state. That's something that's obviously not happening right now, but something that we'll continue to push for.
And then one final thing, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
one more.
I'm sorry. Last week, the Israeli Minister of Education, Yoav Kish, said that Lebanon will be annihilated and there is, quote, no difference between Lebanon and Hezbollah. What's your response to a person tasked with educating Israelis saying such a thing?
Well, obviously that statement is not true, and those comments are completely inappropriate.
So can I just on that, you said the Palestinian Authority, one of the defects or shortcomings is that the PA doesn't have control over Gaza. Do you think that the PA has effective governing control over the West Bank?
It has effective governing control over parts of the West Bank, certainly not all of it.
Some of it?
Yeah, some of it.
Which parts?
The parts that it is in control of, and then there are other parts where Israeli maintains security control. So it certainly does with parts of the West Bank.
Thank you. And today marks the fourth week since the killing of Turkish-American activist Aysenur Egi by Israeli forces in the West Bank. Do you have any updates on the investigation?
So we were engaged in recent days with the government of Israel about exactly this question, and we're informed that the full criminal investigation is still ongoing.
And have they given you any timeline?
I'm not aware of any timeline. It's possible they've given it to other officials. I'm not aware of one, no.
One more on this. 103 U.S. Congress members have sent a letter to Secretary Blinken and President Biden and the Justice Department calling for an independent investigation into the killing of Aysenur. Can you confirm if you received this letter, and do you have any response to them?
So I'm sure we have received the letter. I'm not aware, but I'm sure we have, and we will respond to them in due time through our normal process, as we always do. But when it comes to whether there needs to be a subsequent investigation, we've made clear we want to see the full criminal investigation play out first before we make any other decisions.
I want to follow up on the limited ground operation. You don't want to define it, but what you are against, I mean, are you against the Israelis staying in South Lebanon? Are you against another occupation? I know you don't want to define the limited operation.
We want to see a diplomatic resolution, period. And I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah, go ahead.
A follow-up regarding the civilian casualties in Lebanon. During the past week, Israel targeted many residential buildings and heavy airstrikes. In one of them, 33 people were killed in Bekaa. Israel always is claiming that there are Hezbollah members there. How is the U.S. not condemning or finding it normal that a whole building can be targeted only for one person, even if kids are being torn to pieces? Sometimes we don't see a Hezbollah member in that building after it was hit by an airstrike.
So we don't want to see a single civilian casualty in Lebanon. Yeah, we are seeing them as we see them in other conflicts, and it is a tragedy, and it is why we are trying to pursue a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. This conflict never would have started. Again, if we want to talk about culpability, if Hezbollah on October 8th hadn't started attacking Israel. I know, but it's important to understand why Israel is defending itself against these attacks. It's because Hezbollah started a conflict with Israel on October 8th. Had nothing to do with Gaza. Nothing at all to do with Gaza. They started the conflict, and Israel has a right to defend itself against that terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean that every civilian death isn't a tragedy. Of course it is, and Israel needs to do everything possible to minimize civilian casualties. But the reason why this conflict, just before you interrupt, just let me finish. The reason why this conflict is happening in the first place is because for 12 months, Hezbollah has been attacking Israel. 12 months, and has been unwilling to cease those attacks. And that's why Israel's defending itself.
Yeah, but they are not doing a better job. We saw it in Gaza, and we're seeing it again in Lebanon. There's always a lot of civilian casualties. There are always kids that are being targeted, aid workers being targeted. So they're not doing their best job.
They absolutely need to do more to minimize civilian casualties. And ultimately, it's why we want to see a diplomatic resolution to the conflict, is because not just the destabilizing effects on the region, but the terrible toll that this war produces for civilians in Lebanon, that's produced for civilians in Gaza, and of course that it produced on October 7th for civilians inside Israel. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matt. In Pakistan, this donut shop has become very popular by the name of Krusty's because its employee.
So just to follow up on that question, if you're not giving up on the left and the Israelis are targeting Hezbollah, but then how they are targeting them also is questionable. But the thing is, regarding the infrastructure and the institutions in Lebanon, is there a kind of warning from the U.S. government that they should not target, for example, the airport, the port, the LAF?
We absolutely do not want to see civilian infrastructure targeted. Terrorist infrastructure, Hezbollah targets, of course, are legitimate targets for the IDF, just as America and other countries would strike terrorist organizations that targeted them. But we do not want to see civilians targeted. We do not want to see civilian infrastructure targeted.
And one more question. Yeah. The Israeli Prime Minister also said that he wants to change the face of the Middle East, and he was addressing the Iranian people. So what do you read in this speech? Because he made this speech before also his operations in Lebanon.
So I have not seen his full remarks. I saw that he released a video today. I haven't watched them in full, so I'm a little bit reluctant to comment on them at this time. Yeah, Tom.
Just wanted to.
Over the last few hours, Israel has been striking not only in the Houthis suburbs, but also in Kola, which is inside Beirut for the first time. It's an area, Kola, that it's a connection point to the airport where there is many foreigners, not just Lebanese people from many sects. So it's not just Hezbollah. Are you concerned about this more recent strike? And is it time to ask, are you in coordination with Israel about what is a red line, what is not a red line, where to strike and bomb? Because there is U.S. citizens in Lebanon, and that's an area frequently.
So I've seen reports of that strike. I don't have any further information about it, so I wouldn't want to comment on in detail. But as I said earlier, of course, we do not want to see any civilian targets, any civilian infrastructure targeted in any way. Let me go to Nick, and then we'll wrap it.
There's reporting the U.S. will not seek another term on the UN Human Rights Council. Is that accurate, and if so, why?
It is accurate. We decided not to seek another Human Rights Council, as another spot on the Human Rights Council at this time, just because we were engaged with our allies about the best way to move forward. There were 3 seats available, 4 countries that were interested. We looked at the other countries that were running for this spot, Spain, Iceland, Switzerland. All of them are countries with a very strong record of support for human rights. We thought they could carry the flag forward, but we will engage. We will continue to remain engaged on human rights issues and are currently slated to run again in 2028. With that, we'll wrap for today.
On what you were talking about earlier, Netanyahu is actually expanding the war. So despite U.S. calls for diplomacy, as you mentioned earlier, ceasefire, he's expanding it not just into Lebanon, but also into Yemen. Is it safe to say that he's simply ignoring U.S. concerns?
So let me take a little issue with the way you frame the question. Israel did not attack Hezbollah first. Israel did not attack the Houthis first. In both those cases, those were responses by the government of Israel to attacks from terrorist organizations. So they struck Hezbollah after taking months and months of rocket fire and last week missile fire, drone fire from Hezbollah. When it comes to the Houthis, they have been on the receiving end of attacks, including in recent days from the Houthis that they were responding to. So they, like every country in the world, have a right to defend themselves from terrorism. Now, the way they do it matters, ensuring that they do so in a way that doesn't that avoids miscalculation and doesn't needlessly increase tensions. That is the type of thing we will continue to be in conversation with them about. But I think we ought to just be clear about the facts of what happened.
Sure, but I mean, you have mentioned that the U.S. has counseled restraint. I mean, have you seen any restraint?
So I'm going to just go back to what I have spoken to, which is we want to see a diplomatic resolution. But when it comes to restraint, we also support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism. If the United States was on the receiving end of a terrorist organization, launching rockets at us, we would defend ourselves against that terrorist organization. If that was Hezbollah, if that was the Houthis, if that was Hamas, I can guarantee you those are steps that we would take. Those are steps that just about any country in the world would take. Now, the way they do it matters. The fact that they need to be smart and strategic matters, and we're going to continue to talk with them about how best to accomplish those goals, but they absolutely have the right to defend themselves against ongoing attacks from terrorism.
Understood.
One bit of clarification here. Are the Houthis currently a designated FTO?
They are not a designated FTO, but they,
Isn't one of the first things this administration did when it came into office to remove the Houthis
if
from
you
the
recall, we
FTO
have
list?
designated them under another
Yes,
another
I know,
designation
but
and continue under this other designation to refer to them and treat them as a terrorist organization.
All right, I just
Yeah.
want to
Yeah,
make
just-
the point that
yeah.
they are not an FTO at the moment. Sorry.
One follow-up on Lebanon, and I will have one more question on the region. You said Israelis told you that this is a limited operation. Can you elaborate more on that? Like, how do you define a limited operation, and how do you define a major operation?
So I am. This is not a U.S. definition. This is what they have informed us that they are currently conducting, which are limited operations targeting Hezbollah infrastructure near the border. I will let them speak for themselves about what the operations actually are.
And
These are limited ground operations.
That is our understanding. But again, they should speak to that, not us. Yeah.
Follow up on the points about, I mean, you were asked a lot about your demands, or your calls rather, for a ceasefire last week. But you did more than that, because you were calling for restraint repeatedly. And the US was leading the diplomatic charge at the United Nations on this. What we have definitely not seen is restraint. And you talked about a ceasefire involving two sides, but on this we have seen a very sharp escalation by the Israelis. So your call for restraint has failed.
So we continue to call for a diplomatic resolution, but at the same time, as I said, Hezbollah has continued to launch rockets that have kept Israeli civilians from returning to their home, and Israel absolutely, along with every country in the world, has a right to defend itself from terrorism. It also has a right to go after legitimate terrorist targets like Hassan Nasrallah, and we support them taking those steps, just as we have brought terrorists who targeted American citizens to justice over time. But that said, we long-term want to see a diplomatic resolution. That's what we're continuing to pursue.
But it's just all those things were true. You know, we've seen the Hezbollah rocket fire for many, many months. What we've had in the last week or two is the killing of more than 1,000 people, according to Lebanese officials, in these Israeli strikes. More than 1 million people displaced, according to the United Nations. I mean, that's a huge, game-changing escalation. And last week, you were calling for restraint. So I'm just sort of asking the question about whether or not you think you got restraint, or your calls were heeded.
Let me just take a few things specifically when it comes to the death of Hassan Nasrallah, which is, I think, the event that most people have referred to as the most escalatory. We support bringing him to justice. We think that ultimately is something that's good. We think that's ultimately something that's good for the country. Now, yes, of course, we do not want to see any civilian harmed in that attack or in any other, but we support them bringing terrorists to justice. We support attacks on Hezbollah. But as I said at the beginning, this kind of activity can both enable diplomacy, and it can also lead to miscalculation. It can lead to unintended consequences. And so we're going to continue to engage to try to de-escalate tensions to the best of our ability, ensure that it doesn't lead to miscalculation and unintended consequences. But ultimately, Israel's a sovereign country that is going to make these decisions for itself.
And just on that point about displacement, I mean, I mentioned the UN saying more than 1 million people in Lebanon. I mean, many have had to flee across the border into Syria. Are you happy? I'll rephrase the question. Given the way in which much of this was done, involving warnings delivered by mobile phone from the Israelis for people to leave their homes in the middle of the night, for example, is this process in compliance with international humanitarian law and the way it's been done?
So it's not the kind of assessment I can offer from here. Obviously, to ever reach any of that type of assessment, it's something that officials have to do here, looking at the full facts, and not something I can offer a quick reaction immediately after the events transpire. Yeah.
How worried is this department about the humanitarian impact of 1 million people leaving Lebanon at this time?
Of course, we're worried about the humanitarian impact. We're worried about how that can be destabilizing, as we've seen before during refugee crises. And we are engaged with partners in the region. We'll continue to be engaged to try to find the best way to deliver humanitarian assistance to those people. But ultimately, the best thing that we can do and that other countries in the world can do is find a diplomatic resolution that allows those people to return to their homes. These obviously are not the first people that have had to flee their homes as a result of this conflict. You've had somewhere around 60, 70,000 Israeli families. I think I've seen estimates somewhere around 40,000, I should say Israelis, not Israeli families, somewhere around 40 or 50,000 Lebanese who've had to flee from their homes. So this is unfortunately a problem we've seen since the outset of this conflict, which is why the ultimate way to bring all of those people home is to reach a diplomatic resolution.
And is there any near-term prospect of getting them the things that they need as they're fleeing and leaving their homes?
It's something that we're working on with humanitarian organizations. Obviously, we're in the early days of this humanitarian situation, but we are in contact with our partners in the region and humanitarian organizations at the UN and elsewhere about how to best provide humanitarian assistance to those people.